Hello, people. I finished a book, The Great Influenza. And this, of course, is referring to the influenza of 1918, sometimes known as the Spanish flu. And I'm going to get into why they call it the Spanish flu. I'm not even sure where the hell this book came from. It was in the garage here, and we've been trying to clean stuff out, trying to get rid of some of our baggage, and I saw it sitting in there, and I knew I didn't want to get rid of it, so I ended up reading it, and it was a pretty good book. I'm a little bit late with a video because I had started another book, read over 100 pages, and then said, fuck, there's something I don't like about this book, and I never finished that one. I'll probably go back to that one. I don't know. There's bugs out here. This was a pretty good book. If I have any criticism of it, is it spends a little bit too much time in the lab work. Some of the scientists, the medical scientists of the day, trying to find a vaccine for influenza, and we still don't have a vaccine. We can guess at what is the best vaccine, and sometimes it works, but even in these times, sometimes there's only like an 18% efficiency rate. Sometimes it's 50%. Sometimes it's 75%. But the thing about influenza is it mutates so quickly, and this author does a really great job explaining how it mutates so quickly. Get to my notes here. This was published in 2004, 461 pages, and my first note is there is a brief, and in my case, unneeded history of medicine. Edward Snow is mentioned. He's the guy from the cholera outbreak in London. I had just read that. The book is titled The Ghost Map, and they did the same thing in there. They talked about Hippocrates, and Galen, and all the way up through the miasmists. And there was still miasmists around when this 1918 flu, took hold. Bottom of page 33. I don't know what that is, but the trustees of Hopkins' estate were Quakers who moved deliberately but also decisively. Against the advice of Harvard President Charles Eliot, Yale President James Burrell Engle, and Cornell President Andrew D. White, they decided to model the Johns Hopkins University after the greatest German universities, places thick with men consumed with creating new knowledge, not simply teaching what was believed. At this time, and for years beforehand, all the science was getting done in Germany. In fact, medical literature, the language used to be German. You had to be able to read German. I don't think it's that way anymore at all. And somewhere I had read that air traffic control used to be German. You had to speak German, but it's English now. Fifth paragraph, page 68. The World War I is still going on when this hits. And there's some things regarding that I had never read before. Fifth paragraph, 1, 2, 3, 4. In Europe, governments, universities, and wealthy donors help support medical research. In the United States, no government institution or philanthropist even began to approach a similar level of support. As the Hopkins Medical School was opening, American theological schools enjoyed endowments of $18 million, while medical school endowments totaled $500,000. That's backwards. Second paragraph, page 92. this is regarding where the epidemic began. Epidemiological evidence suggests that a new influenza virus originated in Haskell County, Kansas, early in 1918. Evidence further suggests that the virus traveled east across the state to a huge army base, and from there to Europe. Later it began its sweep through North America, through Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa, through isolated islands in the Pacific, through the whole world. In its wake followed a keening sound that arose from throats of mourners like the wind. The evidence comes from Dr. Loring Miner. Nobody can really prove that epidemic started in Kansas, but a lot of the evidence points towards that. It got started being called the Spanish flu because all the other countries were at war at the time. In the United States, Germany, England, France, you couldn't print anything in the newspaper that made your country look bad. So nobody was going to name this the North American flu. Nobody was going to name it the French flu. Spain was neutral during World War I, so they had no restrictions on their newspapers. They were the first ones to really acknowledge that there was a big outbreak going on, a big epidemic. Wilson, everything that I've read about Wilson in here shows that he was a lot like Trump. He didn't even want to mention the thing. He just wanted to downplay it. More about Wilson later. My note here, the next note says Liberty Cabbage. We were pretty crazy when we got into the First World War. The war was almost over. They had to have known that. There was the Great German Offensive. They had to have known that the war was nearing its end. But as the United States geared up to get into this war, we just went crazy and fucking war bonds, and everybody was involved. Everything was involved. Every time you went to see a movie, there was a guy that gave a speech before the movie. So Liberty Cabbage, they started to call sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. And it just reminded me of the stupid, I can't even remember when it was, what prompted this, but idiots started calling French fries freedom fries. I don't know what the hell that had to do. Was that the first Iraq war, the second one? I don't know. Last sentence, fourth paragraph, page 129. One, two, three, four. Oh, yeah. It had also served American troops in the Spanish-American War and during the insurrection in the Philippines that followed. I took issue with that word, insurrection. They were fighting for their own country. That wasn't an insurrection. Those were heroes. Those were freedom fighters. Just because they were fighting against United States troops, to me, that doesn't mean anything. Bottom of page 171. We're not always right just because we're American. There it is. 171. Spain actually had a few cases before May, but the country was neutral during the war. That meant the government did not censor the press, and unlike French, German, and British newspapers, which printed nothing negative, nothing that might hurt morale, Spanish papers were filled with reports of the disease, especially when King Alphonse XIII fell seriously ill. The disease soon became known as the Spanish influenza or Spanish flu, very likely because only Spanish newspapers were publishing accounts of the spread of the disease that were picked up in other countries. Masks, there's a little bit about masks in here, and we all know the stupidity that resulted in this country because of COVID and the masks, uh, they started to test the masks to see if there was any efficiency in stopping the transmission of the disease. And it soon became clear that there was a lot of efficiency, so everybody wore masks. I didn't see anywhere in this book where there was any kind of mask protests or anything like that. The Spanish flu affected your sense of smell, just like COVID. We already talked a little bit about Wilson being as bad as Trump. Troop ships, they sent troop ships to Europe from here. They came off of bases where there was raging epidemics. People died on the way to Europe. Uh, People on one troop ship could actually see the other troop ship dumping bodies overboard. The German offensive of 1918, that was supposed to be a three-step offensive. The third step never came because the German troops were suffering so much from this flu. And I mean, there's other reasons too. The German troops were basically starving, and whenever they would break through the lines, they just looted. They, instead of doing what they were supposed to do, they looked for food. Uh, then we jump all the way to the end of the war. Wilson is in the negotiations with France and England. They did not allow Germany to take part. The Russians refused to take part. Wilson gets the flu, they think. In history books, you're going to read that he had a mild stroke, but he got the flu. This flu had really weird complications that weren't always the same with everybody. And Wilson, his thinking is affected. And he gives up on all the things that he was trying to do in the negotiations. And, you know, one thing follows another. And so the Versailles Treaty is signed. It's very harsh towards Germany. And you have to keep in mind that Germany did not start World War One. Germany is really not the bad guy in World War One. There's a lot of propaganda about, you know, babies on bayonets and shit, but that is what it is. It's propaganda. They did not mobilize first. And you got to know what that means. When somebody mobilizes, when Russia mobilizes and France mobilizes, what choice does Germany have? But I'm getting way off base here. Bottom of 385, top of 386. So the Spanish flu, you know, not only had the effect then, but most historians are in agreement that the harshness of the Versailles Treaty pretty much caused the Second World War. Now in bed, he approved a formula Clemenceau had written demanding German reparations and that Germany accept all responsibility for starting the war. And when they say now in bed, they're talking about Wilson. The Rhineland would be demilitarized. Germany would not be allowed to have troops within 30 miles of the east bank of the Rhine. The rich coal fields of the Saar region would be mined by France, and the region would be administered by the new League of Nations for 15 years. And then a plebiscite would determine whether the region would belong to France or Germany. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which Germany had seized after the Franco-Prussian War, were moved from Germany back to France. West Prussia and Posen were given to Poland, creating the Polish corridor that separated two parts of Germany. The German Air Force was eliminated, its army limited to 100,000 men, its colonies stripped away, but not freed, simply redistributed to other powers. Okay, my next note is penicillin. When they were trying to isolate the virus that causes influenza, it had been discovered years and years before. It's a very hard thing to grow in the laboratory environment. By accident, they discovered that if there was some penicillin in there, it kept the other viruses from growing, but it did not affect the influenza virus, thus making it that much easier to grow the influenza virus and then they had it to study. They used it for 10 years just for that. Nobody had any idea that they could use it as an antibiotic. Uh, the childhood stories of penicillin growing on cheese, I Googled it and I was trying to figure out where the fuck that came from. That another guy actually discovered it like 40 years before that. I never did find anything about cheese. It wasn't until 10 years later that they said, well, fuck, we can use it. If it's killing these things, we can use it. It has affected our DNA. A lot of stuff about DNA in here. The virus DNA was very interesting. And then I've got isolation written down here. I wrote that down because there was some communities that were able to completely isolate, and they escaped from, they didn't have any flu cases, much like New Zealand did such a great job with COVID. But that's it. This is getting way too long. Thanks for watching.